So let me ask you a question. What is something that you used to do that for whatever reason you no longer do? Well, I sat down this last week to make a list of stuff that I used to do that I no longer do, and number one on my list was memorize phone numbers. Vast areas of our brains are no longer stuffed with people's phone numbers. In fact, I call and text my kids all the time, but if asked, I would have no clue what their phone numbers actually are. Whereas we used to stuff into our brains like dozens and dozens of phone numbers. But here's something else that we don't do anymore. Second on my list is write letters to pen pals. When I was younger, if we wanted to meet someone new who didn't live in our city and get to know their world a little bit better, we'd sign up for a pen pal. Then we'd write a letter, seal it in an envelope, drop it in a mailbox, and if you were lucky, you might get a reply 4 to 8 weeks later. And if you were really, really lucky, the other person would send a photo. Today, we travel around the world in milliseconds, looking at photos and connecting with people, but once upon a time, we actually wrote pen pal letters. It's amazing how much has changed in a lifetime. I remember when I used to take a roll of photos, carefully rewind the film canister, and then mail the canister to Kodak to be developed into slides, and then they would mail it back to me, and I would put them in a projector so we could project them on a screen. I remember when I used to research topics for a paper or a sermon in the latest set of Encyclopedia Britannica that were stored in a library, but now I haven't been to a library for decades. I remember when I used to adjust the rabbit ear antennas on our TV in order to get reception for our 2 channels coming in cleaner on our 12-inch black and white TV, which was the only screen in the house. I remember when we used to make sure that we had enough change in our pocket in case we needed to use a phone booth, or when we used to look up the spelling of a word in a big old dictionary. And I remember when we used to love the word evangelism. We had evangelism classes, and we would go out evangelizing people. But today, all of these have disappeared, including evangelism. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the word evangelism, that's the English word that comes from the Greek word that is used about 55 times in the New Testament and 10 times in the book of Luke. The Greek word is euangelizo, meaning to announce good news or to bring the good news or the gospel. When I was younger, evangelism in a church was right up there with preaching and worship. We had evangelism explosion workshops, we had evangelism classes, we had evangelism afternoons where we would go to downtown or out on the streets to have conversations with people sharing our faith. And the concept was based on a whole bunch of verses, including the theme verse of our book of Luke, where Jesus said in Luke 19:10, "The Son of Man came to seek and to save those who are lost." In Luke 5:10, after a ridiculously successful fishing adventure, Jesus said to his disciples, James and John, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will bring in people instead of fish." Jesus was saying, "I will make you fishers of men, bringing people into my kingdom." In Luke 24 and Matthew 28, Jesus said, "Therefore, you go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands that I've given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Spreading the good news, telling people about Jesus, witnessing of the hope and salvation available in Jesus, and evangelism, announcing what Jesus did for us, has always been understood as what Jesus called his followers to do. Except, like reading encyclopedias and adjusting the rabbit ears or mailing to pen pals, we don't do it anymore. So instead of simply telling you to do evangelism like we used to do it, let's ask this more interesting question. Why don't we do evangelism anymore? As I thought more about this, I've come up with 5 reasons why we don't do evangelism anymore. Number 1, we've grown up in a culture of tolerance and acceptance. More primitive societies had closed communities with rigid intolerance of deviation from the customs and beliefs. However, in our lifetime, tolerance has become the highest value in our culture. Today, what binds our culture together is not a shared set of beliefs or customs, but rather a commitment to tolerance. Tolerance has become the centerpiece of our society. Tolerance being understood as the unconditional acceptance and support of differences. Western cultures value freedom like nothing else, and tolerance has become the crowning jewel of our culture, the ultimate expression of freedom. To put it bluntly, we don't want our freedoms to be limited, so it would be wrong to limit the freedoms of those with whom we disagree. Into a culture where freedom and tolerance are synonymous with being a moral and respectable person, evangelism has become synonymous with intolerance and bigotry, and a voice that says, "You're lost, I'm found, I know more than you do," which doesn't go over very well. But here's a second reason we don't do evangelism anymore. Number two, we've seen evangelism at its worst. The world has watched evangelism cause tremendous amounts of hurt. From boisterous street preachers who tell everybody they're going to hell, to billboards telling drivers that there will be hell to pay, to kids with placards declaring God hates you, to Christians gone bad and declaring that God laughs when soldiers die, and that God is your enemy and curses you. Many of us feel guilty by association. Rather than winning a few to Christ, these misguided and deeply damaging efforts have helped to silence tens of millions of Christ followers from opening their mouths about Christ for fear that they're going to be lumped in with them. But here's another more personal reason we don't do evangelism anymore. Number three, evangelism turns us into salespeople. Evangelism is usually taught with the singular goal of closing the sale and the finish line of getting the other person to pray the sinner's prayer. Evangelism can often come across as insincere, gimmicky, and artificial. Often the gospel is dumbed down and presented as a cure-all, one-time inoculation against all the wrongs of life. All you have to do is welcome Jesus into your heart, and life will magically get better. So preachers especially love to recite the numbers of people who raised their hands or prayed the prayer and sealed the deal. But the problem is that most of us aren't salespeople. And we get weird and unnatural when we are pressured into being salespeople for Jesus. Now, the next reason we've abandoned evangelism is a bit more sobering. Number four, we've lost our credibility. In a Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs article entitled "Saving Ourselves from Evangelical Christianity," Wendell Griffin wrote this: "Thanks largely to evangelical Christians, Christianity as a world religion is often identified with and considered complicit in imperialism, colonialism, oppressive capitalism, white supremacy, racism, sexism, including homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny, militarism, environmental injustice, xenophobia, and a host of other oppressive forces." He goes on to say, unless its undemocratic aspirations and actions are countered and defeated, Christian evangelicalism may become a substantial cause of death for democracy in the United States and a cancer that threatens the rest of the world. We should not invite that fate on ourselves. Wow, it's pretty hard to have the word evangelical splashed all over the news and to hear of how evangelicalism has been radicalized and become the enemy of democracy and still feel good about evangelism. Additionally, to look back on the footage of the U.S. Capitol riot and insurrection on January 6, 2020, you think Jesus ordered it himself. His name was everywhere. As protesters and rioters marched in the U.S. Capitol, it would almost appear as if Jesus himself was leading them. Events like these have only further robbed us of our credibility and have caused us to do everything we can to disavow ourselves from anything associated with evangelical or evangelism. Now that's a lot of negativity and honest reflection. And in a few moments, we're going to name one final reason why we've abandoned evangelism as we know it. And then we're going to ask two questions. How did Jesus do evangelism? And are there ways to fulfill our calling to be a witness and to spread God's love and truth and hope without being jerks about it? But first, let's take a few moments to refocus our hearts on God as we worship together. Welcome back. So far, we've looked at 4 reasons why we don't do evangelism anymore, and I'd like to suggest one more. Number 5, we woke up to the 7 most dangerous words in evangelism. When I was in Bible college, I was taught the Romans road to salvation. I still stand by this as being the essence of what it means to come to Christ. Number 1, the human problem. Romans 3:10, as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. And Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Number 2, humanity's hope. Romans 5:8. But God demonstrated his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Number 3, our response. Romans 10:9-10. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. Number 4, the result. Romans 5, 1-2. By faith we have been made acceptable to God, and now, thanks to our Lord Jesus Christ, we have peace with God. Christ has also introduced us to God's gift of undeserved grace on which we now take our stand. And to close the sale, we would inevitably say the 7 most dangerous words in evangelism. Now all you have to do is. Now all you have to do is say this prayer. Now all you have to do is repeat after me. And that's all fine and good, until we read Luke 14, 25-35 like we did this past week in our chapter a day reading challenge. In Luke 14, large crowds are following the newest rock star preacher, Jesus. Word in the street was that he could heal what ails you, fix what's broken, and solve Israel's problems. All you have to do was follow him. There couldn't be anything easier or more fun. And Jesus turned to this huge crowd of fans who were following him, and it would have been so easy for Jesus to have said, okay, you want to be my followers? You want to receive eternal life? You want to be on God's team? All you have to do is repeat after me. Jesus' numbers would have skyrocketed. Jesus would have gotten another couple of thousand people to say the sinner's prayer and get saved. But instead, this was his approach to evangelism, and this is what he said. If you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else, your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you can't be my disciple. Hang on, that's how not to make friends and influence others. That's how not to close the sale. But what Jesus was saying here is, I'm not hawking cheap grace and easy believism. If you want to follow me, it's going to be costly. Have you ever heard of a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Dietrich's father was a leading psychiatrist and neurologist who lived in Berlin. And Dietrich was born in 1906, but only lived for 39 years. However, in his short lifetime, he advanced the cause of Christ greatly. At age 14, Dietrich announced matter-of-factly that he was going to become a theologian. And he did just that, graduating with a doctorate in theology at the age of 21. But when Dietrich discovered that over half of the seminary students in Germany were followers of Hitler, he started an illegal underground seminary that trained pastors until the Gestapo shut it down. He also served in Hitler's military intelligence organization as a double agent, using the German intelligence to smuggle Jews into Switzerland. When Dietrich was invited to lecture in the United States, it was perfect timing. It allowed him to escape the persecution that was growing within Germany and that all of the other Christ followers were having. However, Dietrich decided that he shouldn't enjoy the freedoms of the U.S. while his fellow Christians were suffering for their faith, so he returned to his home in Berlin. In 1940, he was engaged to be married, but he was arrested before he could get married. Eventually, Dietrich was accused of being associated with the assassination attempt on Hitler and was quickly tried and hanged on April the 9th, 1945, just 6 months before the war ended. However, while teaching in his underground seminary, Dietrich wrote a powerful book entitled The Cost of Discipleship. And in it, Dietrich wrote, "Cheap grace. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in a field. For the sake of it, a man will go and sell all that he has. Costly grace is the gospel, which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies a sinner. Above all, it is costly because it costs God the life of his Son. It is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God." The young theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer captured what Jesus was saying in Luke 14 so well. The process of the lost being found and saved by Christ is not easy, and it is not cheap. And that's exactly what Jesus went on to say in verse 28. But don't begin following me until you count the cost. For who would begin construction on a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everybody would laugh at you. They would say, there's the person who started that building and couldn't afford to finish it. Jesus is saying, before you become a follower of his, make sure you count the cost and have enough commitment and faith to actually follow through. How many followers of Jesus begin having bought the sales pitch and having recited the prayer, and they begin with good intentions, only to be heard saying, well, no, I'm not going to bend my life and my morals and my habits and my desires to Jesus. Jesus can bend his standards, his commands, his guidelines, and his morals to me and my preferences. And Jesus says, no, that's not how this is going to work. So count the cost of what it means to be my follower before you sign up. But Jesus presses his point even further in verse 31. Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he will send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. Now hang on. Jesus said that 2,000 years ago, right? That can't apply today, can it? In the original Greek, the phrase without giving up everything you own is a single word, apodosomahi. It means to separate, to turn your back on, to bid farewell to. Wow, this is how Jesus did evangelism. Unless you are willing to, in comparison to the way you love me, hate everyone in your life, and unless you are willing to count the cost and know the extreme lengths to which I will call you and commit yourself to following through, and unless you are willing to consider what the battle will cost you, don't become my follower. It won't work out for you. It will only end in heartbreak and disappointment. It would be better for you not to follow me. Then Jesus wraps up his evangelism session with these words in verse 34. Salt is good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? Flavorless salt is good neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown away. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. I hear Jesus saying, if you're going to be all excited and committed and salty about following me, and then your faith is going to become bland and tasteless, tame, mild, and boring, I tell you, that kind of faith isn't even good for a cow poop pile. And then he ends with these words, are you hearing what I'm saying? I think one of the reasons we don't do evangelism like we used to is that number 5, we woke up to the 7 most dangerous words in evangelism, which are, now all you have to do is this. Many of us have realized it's more complicated and more demanding than simply saying a prayer. Should we be telling people about the offer of salvation that Christ makes? Absolutely. But we should never be dumbing that down or doing it as an attempt to close the sale, making following Christ seem easy. That only sets people up for failure. So how should we do evangelism or do the sharing of the good news of Jesus Christ? Well, I think 1 Peter 3:15 and John 13:35 are God's coaching to us on how to share our faith. 1 Peter 3:15 says, honor Christ and let him be the Lord of your life. Always be ready to give an answer when someone asks you about your hope. I hear 2 strategies that come out of this. Number 1, honor Christ and let God be the king of your life. Rearrange your life so that it falls in line with Jesus and bend your thoughts and aspirations and morals and habits and values so that you are knelt before King Jesus. When you do this, you will begin to look different than the world. There will be a hope and a peace and a light that shines from your life that is God-powered, and other people are going to see it. Which leads to number 2, always be ready to give an answer. It says in that verse, always be ready to give an answer when someone asks you about your hope. This is a totally different approach than the evangelism we used to do 20 or 30 or 50 or 75 years ago. Here, instead of assaulting people with the gospel or attacking them with it or trying to set them up for the sales pitch, we're simply ready when the time is right, and when someone asks you to explain your joy, your peace, and where your hope is coming from. Peter says, in that moment, don't be shy. Don't be unprepared. Don't be surprised. Simply be ready. But I would love to add, number 3, let love be the magnet. John 13:35, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Our love for each other, our love for the hurting, our love for those who disagree with us, our love for our enemies, our love for people should be so evident, so alive, so genuine and authentic, and so powerfully moving that people recognize us as followers of Jesus and want to know more. And here's one final takeaway from John 13:35. Number 4, do it as a team. When Jesus says, they will know you are my disciples by your love for one another, there's very much a sense that the world is watching the community of faith in action. I may be wrong, but I think with the state of our world and the increasing chaos and turbulence, we're going to be seeing more unchurched and more non-religious people walking through our doors this fall than ever before. And that means we have a tremendous opportunity to not only show how much we love each other, but how much we love Jesus. And when each of us is doing our part, and the church is full of life and truth and light and irresistible love, and people feel this is a safe place to explore faith and ask hard questions without being looked down on, lost people find Jesus, and Jesus finds lost people. Now, there's no doubt that our church and almost every church across North America isn't at its best right now. The pandemic interrupted, derailed, and deorganized so many of our teams, our systems, and our efforts. Additionally, and pastors across North America are talking about this, 30% of the people in most churches have just disappeared. They stopped attending and engaging, and many simply stopped following Christ. What does all this mean for us? I think it means we're heading into a season with tremendous potential. I think in a world that has experienced this catastrophic collapse of meaning, as we talked about last weekend, people are looking for meaning and hope. And if anyone has a reason for meaning and hope, it is Christ Church. So we need to rebuild. We need to rebuild our hospitality team with the friendliest and most authentically welcoming people possible to greet and usher and host and do welcome center and serve and prepare coffee. We need to rebuild our kids ministry team with the zaniest, most energized, kid-loving, creative people with teaching gifts to mentor and disciple kids. We need to rebuild our uprising middle school and high school teams with people who know how to speak life and hope into students' lives. And we need to rebuild our Ascent young adults teams so that we're ready to introduce young adults to Christ. And wow, do we ever need to rebuild our tech teams with people who love serving behind the scenes and get a total rush out of watching flawless technology being used to communicate the message of Christ. When the church is working right, and when the life and love of Christ is pulsating in that church, we're doing evangelism together as one big team called the church. But there's a lot more work that we need to do. This fall, we need to rebuild our dynamic, inspiring worship and musical teams and our production teams. We need to rebuild our prayer and care teams so that we're equipped and ready to carry the difficult loads that people will be walking in with. We need to rebuild our marriage team so together we're caring for the marriages that are just starting out and the ones that are struggling and the ones that need to experience a relighting of the spark. Our community team has been functioning throughout the pandemic, but it's time to have some added horsepower to our community serving teams. We need to rebuild our small groups team. This is going to be so critical to helping people find Christ because life transformation happens best in the context of authentic, loving relationships. So we're going to need 30 new small group leaders and leader couples. Church, I challenge you to, number 1, honor Christ and let him be the king of your life. I challenge you to, number 2, always be ready to give an answer. I challenge you, each of us, to, number 3, let love be the magnet. And I challenge you to see evangelism, the proclamation of the good news and the hope of Jesus Christ, as something we do together. And to, number 4, do it as a team, being a dynamic, life-giving, hope-declaring beacon of light in our community and in our city. But in order for that to happen, we need to shake off the last 2.5 years. In order for the church to be strong and engaging and at its best, we need to break out of the lethargy and hesitancy that this pandemic has inflicted on us and re-engage with an all-hands-on-deck mentality. If you're in the Winnipeg area and haven't been doing so, I challenge you, get out of your PJs and come on back to church. Next, find your team and reframe what you do on that team from simply being a nice serving role to how we do evangelism together. How we be a faith community that invites people to come and explore the claims of Christ in a safe, life-giving environment that inspires them, but also presents the gospel as Jesus did, as costly, precious, and more valuable than anything else on the planet. Church, there are a lot of activities we don't do anymore, like record our favorite shows on a VHS tape, or use travel agents to book our trips, or call movie theaters to get the movie times. However, let's remove evangelism from the list of stuff we don't do anymore. Let's do it, but let's do it differently than we used to. Let's be more informed about the dangers and the inauthentic ways of sharing our faith, but let's never stop telling a lost world about the love of Christ and the hope that is found in Jesus.